we all love, the ones with the dramatic stranglings and it's instantly lights out. Yeah, they're not exactly giving us the full picture.
Not even close, really.
Turns out, death by pressure on the neck, it's way more complicated than just, cutting off someone's air supply.
It really is, yeah. This is one of those areas where modern forensics goes, well, way beyond what meets the eye, way beyond the surface.
And that's exactly what we're diving into today, the surprising reality of how fatal pressure on the neck actually works. And we're going deep with this one, using excerpts from, get this, a real forensic pathology textbook, the kind they actually use to train investigators.
Yeah, and what I think is so interesting is, how much our understanding of this has changed over time. I mean, think about it. For ages, everyone just assumed strangulation was all about asphyxiation, right? You cut off the air supply, that's it. Case closed.
Right. Which seems, I don't know, logical enough. But then how do you explain, well, someone can hold their breath for, a minute? Even longer, maybe.
Yes.
Yet some of these cases, death happens way, way faster.
Exactly. And that little detail right there, that's kind of what tipped off forensic experts that something else was going on, something a lot more complex. It's not just about how long your lungs can handle being without air, but about how this really intricate network of nerves in your neck, how they react to that pressure.
Okay, so there's more to it than someone just not getting air. Tell me more. This is wild.
All right, so imagine this. What if, and just hear me out here, but what if there was actually a kill switch in your neck?
A kill switch? Okay, now you're just messing with me.
No, seriously, a nerve so vital that just the right amount of pressure in just the wrong spot could completely disrupt your whole system.
All right, now that's straight out of a spy thriller. I'm hooked. Keep going.
But it's real. It all comes down to something called the vagus nerve. And this isn't just any nerve, okay? This is a major player in your body, a direct line of communication between your brain and all your vital organs, including, and this is important, your heart.
So the body's own information superhighway, but for, essential functions.
Exactly. Like a high-speed internet cable, but for your organs. The vagus nerve, it's what helps regulate your heart rate, your breathing. It even helps control things like your digestion. It's a busy nerve. But here's where it gets really, really interesting and maybe a little unnerving. So pressure on certain points in your neck, places where this nerve runs really close to the surface, it can trigger something called, get this, vagal inhibition.
Vagal inhibition. Okay, that sounds intense and a little ominous if I'm being honest. What does that even mean?
In the simplest terms, it's it's kind of like sending a shock wave through that vital communication pathway we were just talking about. Pressure on those vulnerable points, it overstimulates the vagus nerve, which then sends this signal to the brain and basically slams the brakes on the heart instantly.
Wait, hold on. So you're telling me just touching someone's neck the wrong way, that's all it takes?
Well, it's not quite that simple. I mean, the pressure has to be very specific in just the right spot and with enough force, but yeah, the potential is definitely there. Even accidentally stimulating the vagus nerve can cause a super rapid drop in heart rate, which in some cases can absolutely be fatal. And what's crazy is this isn't even new information. Way back in the 11th century, this Persian physician, Avicenna, he wrote about people passing out after getting massages in public baths. Turns out those masseurs were probably triggering this vagal response without even realizing it.
Wow. Okay, so we've had this knowledge hiding in plain sight for centuries. This is incredible. We really are uncovering secrets today. But if this vagal inhibition, if it's so powerful, so potentially deadly, why isn't it, I don't know, more well known? You'd think it'd be a slam dunk in every crime drama, every investigation.
That is the million-dollar question in forensics. And it actually leads us to one of the biggest challenges investigators face in these cases. See, unlike, say, classic strangulation, where you often see clear signs of asphyxiation, vagal inhibition, it can be a silent killer. It often leaves little to no visible trace on the body.
Oh, wow. Okay, so how do you even begin to prove that's what happened? Especially, in court. That's got to be so difficult.
You're telling me. Proving intent and the duration of pressure becomes this incredibly tricky thing. It often comes down to circumstantial evidence, witness testimonies, if there even are any, and a really, really deep understanding of the victim's medical history. For example, imagine a scenario, right, where someone playfully, touches their partner's neck, maybe a little too hard, and the unthinkable happens. It turns out to be vagal inhibition, a tragic accident with, well, huge legal implications.
Oh, that's terrifying. Really. It's like this hidden danger most people don't even realize exists. But wouldn't a medical examination, an autopsy, reveal something, some clue that points to this vagal response?
You'd think so, right.
Yeah.
But it's not always that cut and dry. Like we said, vagal inhibition, it can be stealthy. It doesn't always leave behind the same kind of evidence as, say, a blow to the head or even suffocation. It's almost like trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle, but with, like, half the pieces missing.
Okay, so this is where the expertise of like a forensic pathologist, this is where they're worth their weight in gold, right? They're the ones who can look at all those tiny details, subtlest clues, and actually connect the dots. But I have to ask, wouldn't the way the pressure is applied to the neck make a difference? Like someone using their bare hands versus, say, like a rope or a ligature? Those can't be the same, right?
You are spot on. The textbook actually makes a really clear distinction between what we call manual strangulation, so that's using your hands, and then ligature strangulation, which is where an object's involved. And that difference, it has a direct impact on the likelihood of triggering that vagal response we've been talking about.
All right, well, let's break that down then.
Right.
What are the key differences between manual and ligature strangulation, and why does it matter so much when you're looking at a forensic investigation?
So with manual strangulation, the key thing to remember is precision. Think about your own hands, your fingers. They can apply very, very focused pressure, right?
Yeah.
And in the context of the neck, that translates to a much higher chance of hitting those super sensitive areas around the carotid arteries, which, as we know, is right where that vagus nerve is most vulnerable.
So if I'm picturing this right, a ligature, like a rope or a cord, it's less likely to hit that kill switch on the vagus nerve just because of how the pressure is distributed.
Exactly. Now, ligatures are still incredibly dangerous, don't get me wrong. They can definitely be fatal. But with manual strangulation, you have that added layer of complexity. You have that potential for triggering vagal inhibition on top of everything else.
This is definitely starting to paint a much clearer, albeit unsettling, picture. So let's say we're at a crime scene. What are forensic investigators looking for specifically? What are those like telltale signs that might point to manual strangulation versus ligature strangulation?
It's like those crime shows, right, where they're like dusting for fingerprints and all that. But in these cases, a lot of the time, the biggest clues, they're actually in the bruises themselves. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay, so it's like the bruises are telling a story if you know how to read them.
Precisely. The size, the shape, even the color of the bruise, it can tell us a lot. Like with manual strangulation, you're much more likely to see these distinct, almost circular bruises, the kind that match up to fingertips or knuckles.
So you can actually sometimes see the imprint of the assailant's hand.
Sometimes, yeah. And it's not just about the individual bruises either. The pattern they make, that can tell us a lot too. Like, were they coming from the front, the side, behind? These are all things investigators will be looking at.
It's amazing how much information you can get just from, like, a simple bruise.
Right. It's all about connecting those dots, letting those marks tell their story. And speaking of telling details, we can't forget about fingernail markings. Those can be incredibly valuable too.
You mean like scratches, those like little crescent-shaped marks you always see in the movies?
Exactly. Scratches, abrasions, anything that indicates there was a struggle.
Yeah.
And these marks, you usually find them on the victim, especially around the neck. But they can also be on the face, the arms, anywhere the victim might have been trying to defend themselves.
So it's not just the assailant's fingernails they're looking at, but the victim's too.
Absolutely. Think about it. The victim might be desperately trying to pry those hands away, scratching at the attacker's skin in the process. And those tiny fragments of skin, those defensive wounds, they can be a goldmine for DNA analysis.
Wow. So even the tiniest detail could crack the case wide open.
Exactly. It's all about putting the pieces together, figuring out exactly what happened leading up to the death. And those markings, however small they seem, they can play a huge role in that.
It really shows you how much forensic science has, like, evolved. They can take something we'd probably just walk right past and turn it into this whole narrative. But what about when a ligature is used? Are there, like, specific marks you'd look for in those cases?
Yeah, with ligatures, you're typically looking for a single continuous mark that goes all the way around the neck. It'll basically mirror the shape of whatever was used. So a rope, a belt, a scarf, you name it. Anything that can be used to apply that kind of pressure, it'll leave its own unique mark.
So it's less about, like, individual bruises in those cases and more about this single, I don't know, defining mark, like a signature almost.
Exactly. And even the appearance of that mark can tell us a lot, like whether it's pale or discolored or if it's got that, like, rough parchment-like texture, especially if the ligature was left on the body after death.
Man, who knew there was so much to learn about something as I don't know, grim as strangulation.
It's all about those little details, right? They all add up.
Speaking of details, there's something else I wanted to ask you about, something I've always wondered. You know how, like, in movies, they always make a big deal about finding a broken bone in the victim's neck, usually the hired bone, right? I always assumed, like, that was a sure sign of strangulation.
Ah, yes. The infamous hyoid bone. It's a popular one in those crime dramas, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But in reality, it's not quite as clear-cut as they make it seem.
Really? So finding a fractured hyoid bone, that's not, like, a slam dunk for investigators.
It's definitely a big clue, but it's not the be-all and end-all. And get this, it's not even the most common laryngeal fracture we see in strangulation cases.
Wait, hold on. There are other bones in the neck that are more likely to break during strangulation. Okay, now I'm really out of my depth here.
So your thyroid cartilage, the one that protects your vocal cords, it has these little bony projections called thyroid horns.
Mm-hmm.
And those are actually more delicate, more prone to fracture under pressure than the hyoid bone.
Thyroid horn fractures. Okay, well, today I learned, I guess just like with the hyoid bone, finding those fractures, those can provide important clues for investigators too.
Absolutely. The location of the fracture, how severe it is, even the direction it runs in, it can all tell us a lot about the force that was used, the direction of the pressure, potentially even the position of the victim and the assailant. It's like putting together a puzzle.
Man, it's incredible how every single detail matters in these investigations. It's not just about finding a body. It's about, like, understanding the whole story that that body's trying to tell.
Exactly. And one of the most important things forensic pathologists are trained to do is differentiate between a fracture that happened before death, what we call an antemortem fracture, and one that happened after a postmortem fracture.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's huge. How on earth can you tell the difference just from looking at a bone?
It all comes down to one thing: hemorrhage,
Hemorrhage, you mean?
bleeding.
Yeah.
So if there's blood around the fracture site, it means the bone was broken while the person was still alive, while their heart was still pumping. If there's no hemorrhage, it points to a postmortem fracture. Maybe it happened during transport of the body or even, during the autopsy itself.
Wow. That's a game changer. So you could have a broken bone that has absolutely nothing to do with the actual crime.
It happens. And that's why it's so important to figure out when that fracture occurred. It helps us build an accurate timeline of the events, which is obviously crucial in these investigations.
It's really mind-blowing when you think about it. You're looking at bones, bruises, these tiny little scratches. It's like you're piecing together this whole story from a million little fragments.
That's a great way to put it. It's like solving a puzzle. But sometimes the pieces are so small, so easy to miss, you really have to be paying attention.
It makes me think about those crime scene investigators in a whole new light. They're like, I don't know, detectives, but on a microscopic level. But all this talk about fractures and bruises, it's kind of making me think about the other side of this, you know? The cases where it's not so clear-cut, where the lines between accidental death and, I don't know, something more intentional are blurred.
You're talking about those cases where it's not immediately clear whether it was homicide or suicide, right?
Yeah, exactly. And with everything we've been talking about today, with these subtle clues and the potential for misinterpretation, those cases must be incredibly difficult to unravel.
It definitely can be. And one specific type of case that often falls into this gray area is autoerotic asphyxiation.
It's a difficult subject to talk about, but an incredibly important one. For those who might not be familiar, can you explain what autoerotic asphyxiation is and how it relates to what we've been discussing today?
So autoerotic asphyxiation basically involves intentionally restricting oxygen to the brain during sexual activity.
Intentionally. Okay, so why would someone do that?
Well, the idea is to heighten arousal and pleasure
Really? How?
by inducing a mild state of hypoxia. Basically that feeling of lightheadedness you get right before you pass out.
Okay, I think I get it. So it's like they're like pushing the boundaries, looking for a more intense experience.
In a way, yeah. But the thing is, it's incredibly risky. We're talking about manipulating a vital function here, breathing.
Right, obviously. So I imagine these cases, they can be tough to distinguish from suicide, right? Especially if the circumstances aren't clear.
That's the challenge, exactly. It can be really, really hard to determine if someone intended to end their life or if they were engaging in this risky behavior that just went tragically wrong.
So what are investigators looking for in these cases? What are some of the, telltale signs that might suggest autoerotic asphyxiation versus something more, I don't know, sinister?
It's all about context. A lot of times you'll find evidence of these elaborate setups, almost like a scene's been staged,
Or staged how?
Like we're talking ropes, pulleys, sometimes even weights. and they're all meticulously arranged to control the amount of pressure being applied.
Wow. So it's almost like they're, I don't know, trying to control the narrative even in death, right? Like trying to protect their reputation, their loved ones from the stigma.
Right, exactly. And then there's the nature of the ligature itself. Often
Yeah.
it's something that wouldn't be a typical choice for suicide,
Yeah.
like a dog collar or a belt, sometimes even electrical wiring.
So items that might hold some kind of, I don't know, psychological significance to the person?
Yeah, it's about trying to understand the mindset, the motivations behind those choices, even when they seem, well, even when they're hidden. There was actually a case in the textbook, and this is pretty wild, but this person had actually constructed this like large bag, but it was made out of airtight material, and they'd made it specifically for this purpose.
That's wow. It's a reminder that these urges, these desires, they can be incredibly powerful, and sometimes they can lead people down some really dark paths. But it makes you wonder, how do you even begin to address something like this with the family? You know, it's one thing to say someone died, it's a whole other thing to explain that it might have been related to something like autoerotic asphyxiation.
It's definitely a tough conversation to have, one that requires a lot of sensitivity,
Yeah.
for sure. But it also brings up a bigger issue, which is the importance of having open and honest conversations about sex and sexuality. If we can create a space where people feel safe to explore their desires and fantasies without being judged for it, maybe we can prevent some of these tragedies from happening in the first place.
You're absolutely right. Knowledge is power. But, before we wrap up, I want to circle back to something we were talking about earlier about the challenge of proving intent and the duration of pressure in these cases. Even with all the advances we have in forensic science, it seems like it can still boil down to a judgment call, an interpretation of the evidence.
You hit the nail on the head. It's a fine line. And the textbook, it actually addresses that. They talk about this anonymous questionnaire that was sent to a bunch of forensic experts all over the world, and they were asked about their opinions on vagal inhibition, specifically how they diagnose it.
Wow, so like a global poll of forensic minds. What did they find?
It's interesting. Even among these really experienced professionals, there was a lot of variation in how they interpreted the evidence and what they considered to be like definitive proof of vagal inhibition, which really shows you how complex this phenomenon is.
So what does that tell us about, about the state of forensic science? Are we just not there yet in terms of having a clear-cut answer, some kind of black and white test for this kind of thing?
It really speaks to the nature of what we're dealing with, which is the human body. It's not like a simple machine, with on-off switches and predictable results. There's always that element of uncertainty, those variations from person to person, that makes it impossible to have a one-size-fits-all approach to forensics.
It's like they say, every contact leaves a trace. But in these cases, those traces, they're not always so obvious. They can be subtle, like whispers instead of shouts.
Yes, exactly. And it's the forensic expert's job to amplify those whispers, to piece together those tiny fragments and find meaning in them, even when it's hard, even when it seems impossible. And I think sometimes that means acknowledging that we don't have all the answers, that there are still limits to what we can know for sure.
It's a humbling thought, isn't it, to be constantly reminded of the vastness of what we don't know, even as we're pushing the boundaries of scientific understanding. Well, that about wraps up today's deep dive into the world of fatal pressure on the neck. Hopefully you're leaving with more questions than answers and a newfound appreciation for the intricate and sometimes unsettling world of forensic science.
Absolutely. It's a fascinating field, that's for sure.
And to anyone listening who wants to delve even deeper into this topic, we highly recommend checking out the full chapter, Fatal Pressure on the Neck, from Knights Forensic Pathology.
It's a great resource.
And until next time, thanks for listening.